Hello. So my apologies. You're gonna get your project in two videos because I finished my 20-minute rant about poetry, only to find that apparently I clicked the wrong button and closed my camera and shut it off. So the first section that you've already seen, hopefully, it's titled Section 1, is like the beginning. This is Section 2. So this is when I'm actually going to talk about the poems that I want to talk about. So the first poet that I wanted to talk about was Joy Harjo, who I have mentioned in class. I double check this, make sure we're recording. Still recording? Okay, hopefully this works. So I've talked. During for the midterm, I actually talked about one of Joy Harjo's poems, and I think she's an amazing poet, and I really love the way I think she has a really unique insight into hope, because she is actually what Lear is talking about in Radical Hope, the type of cultural collapse that Plenty-Coup and the Crow experience. Harjo is within. She's a poet writing within that experience. So the first poem I want to read is called Grace, for Darlene Wind and James Welch. I think of Wind and her wild ways, the year we had nothing to lose and lost it anyway, in the cursed country of the fox. We still talk about that winter, how the cold froze imaginary buffalo on the stuffed horizon of snowbanks. The haunting voices of the starved and mutilated broke fences, crashed our thermostat dreams, and we couldn't stand it one more time. So once again we lost a winter in stubborn memory, walked through cheap apartment walls, skated through fields of ghosts into a town that never wanted us, in the epic search for grace. Like coyote, like rabbit, we could not contain our terror and clowned our way through a season of false midnights. Excuse me. We had to swallow that town with laughter so it would go down easy as honey. And one morning, as the sun struggled to break ice and our dreams had found us with coffee and pancakes in a truck stop along Highway 80, we found Grace. I could say Grace was a woman with time on her hands, or a white buffalo escaped from memory. But in that dingy light, it was a promise of balance. We once again understood the talk of animals, and spring was lean and hungry with the hope of children and corn. I would like to say, with Grace, we picked ourselves up and walked into the spring thaw. We didn't. The next season was worse. You went home to Leech Lake to work with the tribe, and I went south. And Wind, I am still crazy. I know there is something larger than the memory of a dispossessed people. We have seen it. And I love the way that Harjo in this poem is trying to communicate what it is to live, to hope, to search for grace within that cultural collapse. And I mean, of course, this is the very much parallel to the type of experience that the man and the boy have to undergo within the road as they're attempting to find grace, as they're attempting to find something beyond. I love this line of, the cold froze the imaginary buffalo on the stuffed horizon of snowbanks. Even the sort of mental projections of what was good, the mental projections of our way of life is it's invisible. It's blurry against this horizon of snowbanks. There's no real future to be seen here, and yet the input, as Joyce Carol Oates says, this intrusion of grace within this poem. It's not, I love the way that Harjo stresses that it's not some kind of woman with time on her hands. It's not some kind of miracle white buffalo that is returned from memory. No, it's not. It's not something from the past, and it's not even an individual from the future. But it's that dingy light of a promise of balance. It's the hope of children and corn, and I love the way that it's that right there, that sort of conception of something beyond it's both something that is, hope for what Hario is saying here. The content of hope has to be something that is both beyond the experience of the hoper, but also something that's, meaningful within that experience. And I think this becomes really clear in the second poem that I want to read from Joy Haro. It's called Perhaps the World Ends Here. And it goes, the world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies' teeth at the corners, they scrape their knees under it. It is here that women are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table we gossip, recall enemies and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor falling down selves, and as we put ourselves back together, once again at the table. This table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth on this table, and we have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table, while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite. And I love the way that Hario, again, she's engaging with, like, how do we act? How do we sustain ourselves? What is our attitude? I want to make sure I'm still recording because it should be upsetting if I wasn't. Okay, I am. Good. Well done, computer. How do we act? What is our attitude in the face of desolation, in the face of the unraveling of the fabric of our world? How do we survive? And I love the way that the table becomes this symbol of a communal practice. It is communion. It's a ritual, and it's a ritual born in functionality. Of course, no matter what, we must eat to live. But yet, it is a ritual which, in and of itself, gives birth to a concept worth hoping in. And I think this is what for Hario is the sort of, this is where I would see it connecting with Lear's. I love Lear's line. He says, that for a hope for good to be transcendent doesn't necessarily mean it's transcendent of the world, but just transcendent of our way of understanding the world, or what we understand the world to be. And that's what Hario is getting at here in both of these poems, is that there's nothing within the world that can that's substantial enough to hope in, but yet there's nothing, there's no forms, there's nothing that's there's nothing worth hoping for that's not connected to the world, not expressed and kind of interlaced throughout these objects and of the world, of our functionality, of our survival. And it's in the ritualistic symbolism which we sort of imbue these practices, these objects, these people with, that we're able to produce this sort of rich conceptual like realm, in a sense, maybe not realm, but this sort of rich concept that is substantial enough for us to have a sustaining hope in. And I just think that that's something that obviously Lear, when he's talking about his hope, that his inconceivable hope, he's getting at a type of hope for the good beyond what we can now understand. But what Hario is understanding this as is this hope is necessarily communal. It's necessarily a type of hope in the potential, or in it's a hope that arises, a hope in a concept which arises from the experience of the other. And I think this is brought out so very clear in the next poem, which is called A Litany for Survival by Audre Lorde. And it goes, for those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways, coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward, at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures, like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who are imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hope to silence us for all of us. This instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak remembering we were never meant to survive. And I love this idea. I all of the poems that I got to, or that I wanted to talk about, all are wrestling with this idea of survival, which of course is a huge theme throughout the road. Sorry, I was trying to call you at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm tired. But it's this. There. I think what Hario gets at, the just the simple act of eating, the simple act of being, of living, isn't substantial enough. It doesn't have enough merit to it to really give birth to any sort of hope that's sustaining. But rather it's living within this knowledge of the failure of our survival, is what Lorde is getting to. It's living within the speaking as if, speaking to remember that we will not survive, is it's moving away. She talks about the fear that we learn with our mother's milk, this sort of instinctual desire to survive, isn't really any form of conceptual hope, or isn't substantial enough for us to have hope in. And what can give us a sustaining hope is maintaining the type of liturgy, the type of litany, the type of ritual, like eating around the table, that can produce a concept transcendent from our experience now as the surviving individual, that can transcend that experience, but yet is still kind of grounded in that experience. It's grounded in the type of rituals that we undergo. And I think that is, one of the more fascinating points that we see within the road, is the man's transition from his hope. His hope in the beginning of the book is, a hope in the boy, but it's understood in a moralistic sense. It's understood in I have hope, and as such I must act to help this boy survive. I must keep this boy alive. That is my calling. That is my duty. That is my hope, is for this boy just to live. But by the end of the book, the man's hope is shifted into something else. The man's hope is shifted into something like, I have hope in the goodness that exists outside of my own survival. I have hope that there is good in other people. And this is what I think Hario and I think Lord is pushing into, is this idea that truly substantial hope um, can't be the process of survival. Just in a sense, the world that we exist in isn't rich enough to maintain it. Rather, what we need is to have hope in the ability for us to maintain a conception of the good, to maintain a conception of some sort of transcendent notion within the world, to engage in rituals, to engage in litany. And this is the divide. Like, this is the pull that we see in the road between the process of survival, the process of embracing the fear with our mother's milk, of becoming the beast that lives by whatever means necessary, or the process of maintaining this cultural landscape, not a cultural, a conceptual landscape, and having some hope that that landscape actually corresponds to what's real, that there is something there that transcends the ashes, that transcends the dust and the fire and the death. That's a hope that can actually sustain us. And I think, it's warranted actually to question, whether is that rational? Is it rational to do that? And I don't know if that's the right question. It's whether or not that is a sustaining hope. That is the radical hope Lear talks about. And that is the type of hope that can. I ask at the very beginning, or I mentioned at the very beginning of the class, I'm not sure if, I wonder if it's even rational to, hope to live, to, within the world that we live in today. Far removed, of course, from the world of the road, but even a world dominated by rhetoric of power, of oppression, of economic disruption, and we have just all around us pain. We have suffering. I think is it rational to live? Is it rational to live in knowledge of this sort of rich conceptual world and be aware of the disconnect between that conceptual world and the world of survival, the world of power, the world of greed, the world of need, the world of burning and slashing and taking? Is it even rational to live within that world, to maintain hope for at all? And by the rationality of the woman in the road, no, it makes no sense to just keep living in that. But for her, I think she has that really piercing line, which is echoed both by Hario and by Lord, in which there's the only hope that can sustain us is this sort of hope in the imminent possibility, not even in the necessity, but hope in the possibility of humanity to express the good. Hope in the possibility that humanity can maintain this awareness of the conceptual and sort of maintain this struggle between the conceptual and the demands of survival, the demands of the instinctual. And this is where I love this last poem by Jared Manley Hopkins. It's called Carrying Comfort. And this is a poem, like, in and of itself, it's already, the emphasis here is on the words themselves and not on the sentences, which is already a great it's an act of undermining the way in which we use language. But this is a fantastic poem that I think gets at this struggle between the sort of hope in a substantial hope in the possibility of human goodness and a recognition of the more often realized possibility of human depravity in oneself and in others. So, Carrying Comfort by Jared Manley Hopkins. I'll not, carry in comfort, despair, not feast on thee, Not untwist, slack they may be, these last strands of man in me. Or most weary cry, I can no more. I can. Can something, hope, wish day come, not choose not to be. But but oh, thou terrible, why wouldst thou root on me thy ring world right foot rock, lay a lion limb against me, scan with darksome devouring eyes my bruised bones, and fan. Oh, in terms of tempest, me heap there, me frantic to avoid thee and flee. Why? That my chaff might fly, my grain lie sheer and clear. Nay, and all that toil, that coil, since seems I kiss the rod, hand rather, my heart low, lap strength, stole joy, would laugh, cheer. Cheer whom though? The hero whose heaven handling flung me, foot trod me, or me that fought him? Oh, which one? Is it each one? That night, that year of now done darkness, I wretch lay wrestling with my God, my God. And I love the way that Hopkins is portraying this, this first stanza in which he has this declaration of resistance to despair, this declaration of a strong assault on carrying comfort, and yet by the end of the poem he's wondering, to whom do I cheer? The hero who is heaven handling flung me, or me that fought him? Which one is it each one? And of course, I think in a very real sense they are both himself. On one hand you have the recognition of the concept of goodness, of the recognition of the concept of goodness coupled to the recognition of the violation of the concept of goodness breeds within one this desire of despair. And I think this is what Kierkegaard talks about. I think Kierkegaard is more or less, I think a necessary component for Kierkegaard, of course, is that hope is recognized in despair, but I just don't think Kierkegaard would care very much for your hope if you hadn't experienced despair, because I don't think he like, what hope could there be if you weren't in despair, if you weren't aware of this tension between the recognition of the concept of goodness and the violation of the concept of goodness within yourself. And so if you haven't despaired, how can you ever hope to have enough depth to your being to hope, at least in any real sort of sustaining sense? And so I love the way that Hopkins is putting that image, and of course drawing it together beautifully with language that brings us back to Jacob wrestling God. But this tension within the human being, this sort of push-pull between hope and despair, is actually both fueled by the same thing. It's fueled by a recognition of the concept of goodness, a recognition of its violation, but then also this sort of ability, what Hardo gets at and what McCarthy gets at and what Lords gets at. Thinking about Hardo and perhaps the world ends here, the image of the kitchen table, or McCarthy and the baptism imagery, it's by communal processes which basically imbue the world, imbue this world that has cast aside the concept of goodness with meaning, with a concept itself. It's like we're pulling the world into the conceptual realm in which we can then engage with it in any sort of meaningful, hopeful way. And that process happens through a interaction with the other. It's not something that can happen in the individual. So I just really love the way that these poets were exploring the notion of hope and how that interacted so much with both what we have heard, but what we've talked about throughout the semester, but specifically in how McCarthy portrays hope in The Road. And again, I'm just drawn back to this sort of idea that hope must be recognized communally, but also that hope is necessarily, at least any real sustaining hope is necessarily this sort of hope in the transcendent, but not in the sense that we're hoping for like the transcendent good, but rather that we're hoping in our ability and the ability of humanity to attain and to express the good in the future. Even in the face of all violations, even in the face of the cannibals, even in the face of the blood cults and the beast, to maintain the belief, to maintain the attitude that goodness will find the little boy, to maintain even in the face of war for Joy Hargill, that we will eat the last meal together, and when the world ends, it ends with one sweet bite. There's something there of having hope in humanity beyond their own expressed depravity, that I think is at the foundation of any sort of substantial sustaining hope. But I have rambled a bit. I'm deeply disappointed because I think my first video was much better, but it's lost to the annals of time because I just did a monologue with my computer not doing anything. So my apologies that you didn't get that one. I greatly appreciate all the work you've done for this class. It's been amazing. Very, very much enjoyed it. It's been a really, really great class and a great exploration for me into the notion, into the practice of hope, and the importance which hope has for us as human beings. So thank you. Love you. Enjoy Romania.